In 1982, John Carpenter's The Thing was released. While it was a disappointment both at the box office and critically, it has grown to become one of the most well-regarded and influential horror films of the last 50 years. It tells the story of a U.S. base in Antarctica that comes under attack from an alien life form that is capable of taking the form of any living organism. One of the most notable aspects of the film, aside from its special effects, is how well it was able to combine elements from both the sci-fi and creature films of the 1950s and the slasher films of the 80s. This essay will look at the unique elements that those two eras of horror films had, and will then examine what and how The Thing was able to combine those elements to make a classic horror film. This essay will also look at how Carpenter used elements from both subgenres to make a more horrifying film by preying on the fears of society in the early 80s. According to film critic Rick Warland, the sci-fi horror films of the 1950s typically focused on some sort of other that represents a threat to normal society. The fear in these films usually came from the sense of paranoia and fear that the characters and viewers have of the other. These films are usually based on one of two precepts: alien invasion or the monster among us. Alien invasion films, such as The War of the Worlds, focus on the fear of another group coming to Earth and taking over. The Monster Among Us films, such as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, focus on the idea that there is some monster that can look just like everyone else. These films typically focused on the paranoia that arose from not knowing who the monster was. The main reason that these types of movies were able to be so horrifying is due to the societal issues at the time. The 50s in America was a time filled with fear of the Soviet Union and communism. The fear of a Soviet invasion was a leading factor to the prevalence of alien invasion films, and the fear that anyone, even your neighbor, could be a communist influenced the creation of the Monster Among Us films. The slasher films of the 1980s focused on a monster or maniac that would stalk and kill a succession of people, typically teenagers. These teenagers were, more often than not, females and usually had broken some of society's rules. The most common form of breaking the rules was through sex. Almost every time the characters in a slasher film would have sex, they would then be killed. In all, slasher films normally present the idea that those who break away from traditional society will be punished. This idea bleeds into another common slasher element, what Sarah Drenkansky calls the final girl. The final girl is the heroine of the slasher film. She is the last of her group to survive and is capable of defeating the villain. Unlike her friends, the final girl stays within traditional societal bounds. While her friends are having sex and dying, she is normally a virgin or uninterested in sex. An example of this type of final girl is Nancy from A Nightmare on Elm Street. Another common element of slasher films is their ambiguous endings. Once the monster is defeated, there's usually a clue or sign that allows the audience to believe that the monster is still at large, looking for its next victim. These endings give the sense that the monster is still out there, waiting to punish the next teen that transgresses society's rules. Now that the key elements of both sci-fi and slasher films have been identified, one can examine how these elements are used in The Thing. It combines both the common narrative structures of sci-fi and slasher films. The monster is an alien that is capable of mimicking humans while slowly and systematically killing the members of the base before finally being defeated by the hero. The sci-fi aspect of the film, largely the Monster Among Us element, creates the tense, paranoid, claustrophobic mood of the film. And while the film doesn't have the typical characters of a slasher, the men at the base can be read as outsiders to society. Their location is a remote Arctic base makes them literal outsiders. And the fact that all the members of the base are male creates a homoerotic subtext, while also painting the men as people who have broken society's rules. Though he is hardly a female, Kurt Russell's MacReady could be read as the final girl of sorts. He's the only one capable of outsmarting and defeating the monster. The Thing also has an open ending, as it is left to the audience to decide if one of the two survivors is actually the monster. The question then becomes, why did Carpenter decide to utilize elements from both subgenres? Compared to the 1951 version, Carpenter decided to take his version in some very different directions. The 51 version of the film drew upon the Cold War hysteria and anxiety. The film represented America's fear of the Soviet Union and showed that it could be defeated when everyone worked together. As his film came out 30 years later, Carpenter had different fears in society that he could use to his advantage. Film scholar Edward Guerrero argues that the film can be read as an allegory to the AIDS endemic that hit America in the 80s. AIDS had spread to America from foreign African nations and were able to infect people while giving them no outward signs. The infected could then give the virus to others. By using elements from both sci-fi and slasher horror films, Carpenter was better able to make this allegory. The monster, representing AIDS, is an unknown other from a faraway land. It is able to infect and take over humans, allowing it to spread very quickly. The Monster Among Us format works very well as an allegory to AIDS, since not knowing who was infected with AIDS raised fear and paranoia. Carpenter also used elements from slasher films to help create the AIDS allegory. In the 80s, AIDS was largely seen as a disease only possessed by gay men and drug addicts, people who had broken the rules of society. By creating a homoerotic subtext, Carpenter points at these men as being punished for their sinful ways. The open ending can also be read as representing the futility in trying to fight AIDS. No matter what we think we have accomplished, there is always going to be the disease out there. In conclusion, by using elements from both sci-fi and slasher horror films, John Carpenter was able to make The Thing more terrifying to audiences in the early 1980s.